Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Today we're going to do another episode of Rock and Read. This time we will be reading from Chapter 3 of Janis, Her Life in Music. Chapter 3 is called Thrillseeker. As always, we have a quote at the top which says, "You shouldn't have to be young until you're old enough to cope with it." Janis Joplin. Very true. Alright, let's see what happens in Chapter 3. Janis always looked back to her 14th year as a turning point. In 1970, in interviews and on stage, she would frequently recall that age, usually tinged with bitterness, during a performance of Etta James's feverish Tell Mama, after singing about finding out what you need, what you want, she rapped. "I found out when I was 14 years old, and I've been looking ever since." When a journalist asked why she was miserable as a teen, she answered with the provocative, "I didn't have any tits at 14. While true, this was only part of the story, the part that would get the most attention. Although she had begun to seek an edgier pop culture, rock and roll, trashy novels, racy movies, Janis was still invested in being a conventional daughter, with every school activity memorialized in her Thomas Jefferson High scrapbook, all carefully hand-lettered. As a 10th grader in the fall of 1957, she joined the TJ High student population of 1,920. She became a member of the Future Teachers of America, worked on the Yellow Jacket yearbook, and threw herself into traditional high school purist, pep rallies, student elections, and football games. Her mother encouraged her to work hard, achieve, and make friends. What she wanted was to be popular, her classmate Kristen Bowen explained. Student council people, football players, and cheerleaders were the ultimate type of people. One of the main goals was not to be different, then you wouldn't be popular. Popularity depended mostly on looks, and Janis detested hers, particularly since she had developed acne. She was increasingly insecure about her attractiveness, the beginnings of her lifelong negative self-image. According to Carlene Bennett, Janis particularly hated what she referred to as her little pig eyes. Janis attempted to improve her appearance by rolling her chin-length hair in large curlers and tinting it red. She didn't like her hair, Carlene recalled. She thought her nose was too big, her mouth was too big, she had freckles. Though she and the 98-pound Carlene were both petite and wore the same size clothes, Janis thought of herself as fat, possibly due to rail-thin Dorothy Joplin's focus on staying slim. With a boyish build, Janis's waist wasn't small, and this was back in the days of cinch belts, girdles, and 18-inch waists, Carlene observed. Janis and Jack Smith had broken up, and she envied Carlene and Kristen, who had plenty of dates their sophomore year. Janis's only invitation came from a junior named Roger Irvinson, who asked her to his induction ceremony for the Order of the Demoles, a Masonic youth order. She commemorated the event by pasting her corsage and other souvenirs into her scrapbook, but it would be their only date. Yet Janis did not lack for male companionship. She had a new crew of friends who had become close pals the previous summer. In July 1957, during hurricane season, with two hitting Port Arthur, Janis had returned to the Little Theater workshop. This time she pushed her way into Jim Langdon's tight-knit clique, composed of Grant Lyons, David Moradi, Randy Tennant, and Adrian Haston. These 5 young Turks, all rising juniors, fascinated her. Wearing their hair longer than most students' typical flat tops or crew cuts, they thirsted for new ideas. At the Little Theater, Janis began joining their heady conversations, more than holding her own. The athlete of the group, Lyons, played linebacker for the Thomas Jefferson High Yellow Jackets, lauded locally like all football teams in Texas. He was the first Renaissance man Janis befriended. Unlike his teammates, he had an interest in the arts, visual arts, drama, poetry, writing of all kinds, and music. He recalled about himself and his 4 best friends. Our interests were not those of the average Port Arthur High School student our age. We didn't fit into the sea we were swimming in. Janis joined our group, and she was interesting, loud, kind of bossy, and fun. To budding existentialist Jim Langdon, Janis initially seemed naive and shy, a conventional, very straight little girl entering high school. I remember how absolutely shocked and horrified she was, just aghast when she found out I didn't believe in God. She tried to argue convincingly, but wasn't very successful. As the first avowed atheist in her life besides her father, Langdon's views captivated Janis, even as she made a case for her mother's beliefs. Langdon soon discovered that Janis wanted to grow up a bit and explore who she was. I realized how sharp she was. She gradually became a full-fledged member of our gang and became part of everything we did. Adrian Haston, like Langdon, the son of a refinery worker, found Janis to be self-assured and assertive enough to make friends with 5 guys who were handfuls. That was pretty unusual. She was very bright and talented, but she didn't see it. Dave Marotti, whose father was a Gulf oil engineer, owned a sailboat. Janis joined the gang on sailing excursions, but mostly they just drove around, with Langdon or Marotti behind the wheel. One night, Janis and I drove out to Sarah Jane Round by the refinery with the oil flares burning up. A spooky place, Langdon recounted. We just roamed around looking for some place to talk. The main teenage pastime was either making the triangle, motoring between Port Arthur, Beaumont, and Orange, or doing the drag, cruising Port Arthur's main thoroughfare, Proctor Street. From the beginning, Janis was treated like one of the boys. Though she harbored crushes on them, only one, Randy Tennant, a member of TJ Slide's Rule Club, which Janis would join, asked her out. It wasn't your conventional date, he recalled. It was more like 2 guys getting together and talking about everything, chatter, chatter, chatter. She was good company and could hold up her end of the conversation. She might come up with something interesting or totally off the wall, but she fit in our group. I think that summer was pivotal for Janis, said Langdon. She transitioned very quickly into a different person. We were just a grade ahead of her, but we were a lot further ahead in other areas, Marotti recalled. Everybody realized Janis was fun to have around because she raised so much hell. She wouldn't accept her place as a female or an underclassman. She used to call up and demand to go along on our outings. It was unheard of. Janis's questioning of her mother's conformity intensified as she sought knowledge and affirmation from this older, iconoclastic group. The former tomboy dove into being the boys' club mascot. Entertaining them with raucous jokes was one way to get attention, but Lyons recalled Janis sometimes taking charge. She'd try to make people do what she wanted them to do, he said. She wanted her own way. She was willful, but God knows she couldn't survive around us very long if she hadn't been. We were a bunch of very pushy people, a lot of strong personalities. Janis saw the outsider boys as her godsend. They read books and had ideas, she recalled a decade later. We thought of ourselves as intellectuals. She could have easily been speaking about Seth, whose growing detachment stung less as Janis found her way among younger versions of her father. But not gallivanting with the guys, engaging in hours of conversation, or cracking them up, Janis maintained her friendship with Carlene Bennett and rising junior Arlene Elster, who attended the local synagogue with Carlene. The daughter of a doctor, Arlene drove her mother's Chevy, with Carlene riding shotgun and Janis in the back. They smoked Newports and sang along with the radio blasting. Some drives included stopping by Port Arthur College's tiny radio station, KPAC, to visit classmate volunteers. Elvis still dominated the AM dial that summer of '57 with Too Much, All Shook Up, and Let Me Be Your Teddy Bear. In heavy rotation, they saw Elvis on the big screen in Loving You at the Port Theater. From Lubbock, Texas, Buddy Holly and the Crickets scored with the R&B-tinged rocker That'll Be the Day. Debbie Reynolds was the rare female on the hit parade via her string-drenched Tammy from Tammy and the Bachelor. To find more diversity, the girls tuned in to Beaumont's R&B station, KOLE, where they got an earful with Laverne Baker's exciting Jim Dandy and the amorous Love is Strange by Mickey and Sylvia, as well as Little Richard's Lucille and the Coasters' Youngblood. Other body R&B hits getting play included Etta James's saucy The Wallflower, better known as Roll With Me Henry, and Beaumont's own Ivory Joe Hunter's I Almost Lost My Mind. Sex was all over these songs. Janis and Carlene eventually got up their nerve to meet KOLE DJ Steve-O the Night Rider. I remember going up to KOLE a couple times late at night because Janis wanted to, Carlene recounted. She had this thing about people on the radio, and she wanted to talk to Steve-O because he played rhythm and blues. It was daring to walk into a place where there are older men you don't know and say, "Hey, you want some coffee? Well, go get some." Janis, however, needed to know where the music came from, and unlike Carlene, she didn't fear risk or confrontation. Things were fraught around the Joplin home that fall. In late September 1957, Dorothy had to undergo a hysterectomy, and her relationship with her eldest child began to deteriorate, mostly because Janis, emboldened by her summer thick with the rebel boys, became increasingly independent. She was no longer the eager-to-please daughter who 6 months earlier had written her mother a birthday invitation. Dear Miss S.W. Joplin, in gratefulness for being such a wonderful mother for 14 years, I would like for you to have dinner with me at Luby's on Saturday the 16th. Janiss Lynn Joplin. Carlene, a frequent visitor at the Joplin home, suspected that Miss Joplin had a hard time bending or being different from how she had grown up, and therefore didn't understand or approve of Janiss's new interests. Meanwhile, Seth escaped the family pressures or the recurring darkness of his own mind by disappearing into the garage or the backyard and drinking alone. Roger Pryor, the son of teetotalers, noticed his neighbors drinking, including one day when Seth attempted, unsuccessfully, to walk a tightrope he had strung up in the backyard, and then speed off without her. Carlene and Arlene always returned to pick her up, but Janiss, ever needy and trusting, continued to fall for their pranks. So starved was Janiss for their attention, she forgave them for such ill treatment, even as the humiliations mounted. Once, when she spent the night at the Bennett's home, Janiss and I got into an argument about whether or not she could sneak out of the house and get back in without my parents knowing, Carlene recalled. She knew Janiss's voice could be heard in her parents' bedroom through an air vent, alerting the Bennetts about the plan as the girls discussed it. Fearless, Janiss jumped out the window, landing painfully in a bed of rocks and cactus. Usually, though, when he got loose, he'd just tell old stories, Pryor recalled. When he was drinking, he'd smile a lot. For Seth Joplin, as it would for Janiss, alcohol seemed to promise a release into good times and better feelings, at least in the short term. For kicks, Janiss joined Carlene and Arlene to cruise Port Arthur's red light district, crammed with brothels and gambling dens, establishments that stayed in business thanks to bribes paid to law enforcement, as well as conservative town leaders who looked the other way. According to Carlene's brother Herman, nearly every boy in town lost his virginity at Gracie's brothel. There was no age limit. If you had the money, you didn't care how old you were. Such sexual freedom, of course, did not extend to Port Arthur's teen girls. If word got out that a girl lost her virginity, her reputation was ruined. Carlene and Janiss certainly questioned the hypocrisy. We always wondered why it was okay for the boys, but wasn't okay for the girls, Carlene reflected. One renowned den of iniquity, the Keyhole Club, was noted not just for gambling and sex workers, but also for serving the best hot dogs in town. One Saturday, Carlene and Arlene convinced Janiss to go inside the notorious bar and buy them hot dogs while they waited in the Chevy. When Janiss carried out the proof of her gutsy deed, they pranked her by walking her out of the car. We wanted to make sure everybody saw her there, Carlene explained. She was the first girl I knew to go inside the Keyhole. We'd make up stupid ideas and then get Janiss to do them. I pushed her into doing things that I wished I could do but couldn't bring myself to do. It became clear that Janiss was eager and anxious for our approval and affection, Carlene admitted, which meant she would put up with their mean girl tricks. Other escapades included driving outside town to a secluded spot, crafting a ruse for Janiss to leave the car. When she went back to the front door, Mrs. Bennett was there to scold her, to Karen's smug delight. Janiss sometimes played a similar role among the rebel boys, becoming one of our favorite characters, Morady reflected. I hate to think of how we treated her sometimes. She occupied the position of court jester. To Janiss, their attention was clearly worth the teasing. Janiss's thunderbolt moment arrived in the autumn of '57 in the form of Jack Kerouac's On the Road. Prior to Kerouac, she was struggling to find her identity. Was she a wannabe, popular, God-fearing girl with curlers in her hair who did the bidding of her boy-crazy female peers? Or the wisecracking, whip-smart, sexless mascot of a loquacious crew of older, self-styled intellectual boys? While both extremes offered opportunities to express herself and feel included, neither would make her feel as free as the cinematic storytelling of Kerouac. Every week, Janiss read her parents' Time magazine with absolute regularity, which is where she discovered a feature about the recently published On the Road. Janiss immediately borrowed the novel from Jim Langdon. She devoured Kerouac's visceral narrative of Saul Paradise's adventures with reckless-teen variety, inspired by Kerouac's traveling companion and muse Neil Cassidy, whom he described as looking like a young version of the Texas-born singing cowboy Gene Autry. Paradise and Variety even passed through the Golden Triangle in On the Road's pages. We took a chance on one of the dirt roads, and pretty soon we were crossing the evil old Sabine River that is responsible for all these swamps. With amazement, we saw great structures of light ahead of us. Texas! It's Texas! Beaumont Oil Town! Huge oil tanks and refineries loom like cities in the oily, fragrant air. Now driving the triangle from Port Arthur to Orange to Beaumont with the boys made even more sense to Janis. They too could be Kerouac's sordid hipsters of America, a new beat generation, with their real straight talk about souls. Sex and drugs and drunkenness and rootlessness, evils that Janis's parents tried to shield her from in her selection of library books, lest she suffer the fates they had seen befall their ancestors. Their warnings and admonishments, however, held none of the power of Kerouac's musical, defiantly anti-establishment prose. For Janis, On the Road was a revelation, according to Carlene. It would take several years for her to follow Kerouac's lead, traveling from Texas to San Francisco for the first time. But at 14, she had discovered her first kindred spirit in literature, and this would inform everything going forward. Her final break with convention was yet to come, but she began calling herself a beatnik, which she would never stop doing. Soon after reading On the Road, an emboldened Janis connected with her own Sal Paradise. Alongside of the track's T.J. Hyde Jr. named Rooney Paul, who looked like a cross between Elvis and James Dean, and lived downtown with a single working mother. That was her first love, in Carlene's opinion. He worked at a drive-in and lived in a rooming house on Proctor. Carlene drove her there on several occasions and picked her up an hour later, but the unconsummated relationship fizzled. After Paul quit school in 11th grade and joined the Army, Janis continued to sketch his portrait. In one surviving drawing, he wears a t-shirt, a James Dean-style jacket, and jeans. Apparently it was Paul who had done the spurning. I was very young, and I didn't have any experience in relating to people, Janis later said. Every time one of my overtures would be refused, it would hurt. In 1958, Janis, at 15, continued going through the motions of a typical Eisenhower-era teen. Mementos passed in her scrapbook at the end of her sophomore year include team spirit flyers and handbills promoting student council candidates. No hint from these pages of her nascent beatnik identity. Similarly, her first high school annual is cluttered with salutations, advice, and mostly compliments penned by fellow students. Her best friend's inscription, however, takes a different tone, an adolescent hand at ivory perhaps, but reading somewhat callous on the page. Don't believe all the nice things people have been writing about you, Carlene scrawled on the yearbook's back page. They're not honest. Actually, they're afraid to say you're conceited, young, and impressionable. I realize you know how clever I am, so we won't go into that here. Just keep working, and maybe someday you'll be as clever as I am. Don't hold your breath till then. Janis's confessional message in Carlene's annual is markedly less caustic and suggests she is confounded by the complicated relationship. To a good old egg, I've tried in vain to analyze you, but I can't, so I figured, what the hell, heck, stay confused. I wish I could figure you out. Who do you like now? Mickey, Dennis, Jim, or David? I hope I will get to know and understand you better next year. Remember me always. Says Janis. P.S. Remember, I am a virgin. That summer of '58, Janis set out to reinvent herself in the vein of a Kerouac heroine. She got a flattering, very short haircut at the best salon in town. She took up red lipstick and eye makeup and began visiting a dermatologist for painful acne treatments. She also developed a new laugh, a loud cackle which she practiced at Carlene Bennett's. She'd ask, "Is it annoying enough? Should it be louder?" Carlene recalled. In Time magazine, Janis read about the scandal of Louisiana's Jerry Lee Lewis, who had scored the massive hits Whole Lot of Shakin' Going On and Great Balls of Fire the previous year. His career tanked after the disclosure of his marriage to 13-year-old second cousin Myra Gale. The magazine published a letter to the editor condemning Lewis and his teenage fans. Janis was so angered that she wrote her own response to Time, defending Lewis, rock and roll, and her generation. Though Time didn't publish her letter, she got a sympathetic reply from the News Weekly dated July 28, 1958, which Janis pasted into her scrapbook. She'd later meet the man she championed, with agonizing results. That summer, Watershed came when Janis passed driver's education and got her license. Another milestone noted in her scrapbook. Behind the wheel of her father's meticulously kept car, she was no longer a passenger, but the master of her destination. I remember when she backed out of the driveway the first time, alone, and drove out, Seth Joplin recalled. I watched her. You never saw a bigger smile. She was overwhelmed with the joy of being able to do it alone. Like her beatnik heroes, at last she could cruise the open road. On her first drive, she collected Kristen Bowen, and they conspired to pick up some teenage boys, Kristen reported in her diary. She let them off except for Billy Brown, who sat between us. He was real fresh and sort of cute, but loud, biggest flirt I ever saw. The next evening, rushing home from the Bennett's house before a curfew, Janis ran a stop sign and crashed into another car, totaling both vehicles. Fortunately, she and the other driver were unharmed. After the accident, Seth grounded her. "How could you be so dumb?" he yelled, in a voice we seldom heard. Her sister Laura wrote in her book, Love Janis. It was the biggest problem any of his kids had ever caused, and he seethed in astonishment. Janis was crushed, embarrassed, frustrated, and upset that she had failed so miserably. Once again, she was relegated to the back seat of her friends' cars. Janis found comfort in records shared that summer by the Little Theater Gang. Langdon collected jazz 78s, and Janis too started seeking out new sounds. "In a record store, I found a record by Odetta, and I bought it," she said later. Of what she called Odetta's folk blues, ox driver songs. Born in Alabama and raised in California, Odetta, at 13, trained in opera and musical theater before becoming the sole black female folk singer in San Francisco in the mid-1950s. After buying her 1956 solo debut, Odetta Sings Ballads and Blues, Janis taught herself to reproduce Odetta's round tones. "I really dug it," she recalled, "and I played it at a bunch of parties and everyone liked it. We used to go to all the beaches and sit on the beach, and we'd go to this old Coast Guard shack. You'd go all the way to the top and you'd look out on all this water and marsh, and we used to sit up there and sit around and talk. We were up there one day and someone said, 'I wish we had a record player,' and I said, 'I can sing.' 'Come on, Janis, cut it out.' I said, 'I can too.' So I started singing a real Odetta. Ya la la. I came out with this huge voice. They said, 'Janis, you're a singer.' They told me I had a great voice, and I thought, wow." The moment contained everything Janis had craved for so long. Surrounded by a close group of peers, and all of them genuinely astonished by her. She could feel it. The music she was singing was rooted in the blues, which spoke to her early sense of loss. She had seen and heard singers who lived an unconventional road-going life, like rock's heroes, and that road now seemed closer. "From the very beginning," said Jim Langdon, "when it was nothing more than sitting around a record player on the living room floor, or in the back seat with 4 or 5 of us, there was never any doubt in my mind that Janis had a world-class voice, and that she could do anything she wanted with that voice." Impacting Janis even more than Odetta was Louisiana-born Huddy Ledbetter. "Grant Lyons told me about somebody called Lead Belly," Janis recounted time and time again. "He bought Lead Belly records, which were far-out country blues. I was a soprano singing in the church choir. I didn't know I had that kind of voice. Then Grant Lyons played a Lead Belly record for me. That started it." 2 decades before Janis heard his music, 46-year-old Lead Belly, released after serving a second prison term for slashing a white man's arm, started his career in New York, promoted by Texas-raised folklorist John Lomax. The bluesy songs Lead Belly sang and played on his 12-string guitar, Matchbox Blues, Rock Island Line, Midnight Special, Careless Love, Alberta, and C.C. Rider, also called Easy Rider, became some of Janis's favorites. To her delight, she founded the Gates Memorial Library, a copy of the 1937 book by John and Alan Lomax, Negro Folk Songs as Sung by Lead Belly. Exploring his music, she eventually learned his topical protest songs, including Borgias Blues. Them white folks in Washington, they know how to call a colored man a just to see him bow. Janis was 6 years old when Lead Belly died in December 1949, at age 60 from Lou Gehrig's disease. The following year, his signature song Irene became the top pop hit of 1950 as Goodnight Irene for folk quartet The Weavers featuring Pete Seeger. Decades after Janis discovered Lead Belly, Kurt Cobain would cite him as his favorite artist as Nirvana launched into a version of the bluesman's In the Pines, also known as Where Did You Sleep Last Night on MTV Unplugged. Janis put her own stamp on songs recorded by Appalachian balladeer Gene Ritchie, known for a pure mellifluous soprano. Janis had a true chameleon's voice, according to Langdon. She could sound like Odetta, a black woman with a very deep voice. She could turn around and sing Gene Ritchie's Appalachian songs. This real thin soprano, it would sound just like Gene Ritchie. She was tremendously versatile, with tremendous range. According to Grant Lyons, though the boys sang folk and blues songs while driving around, when Janis chimed in they would, for once, shut up and spotlight her with their rapt, undivided attention. It was an overwhelming voice, he said. There was no point in singing along with Janis if she was going to sing like that. That's the end of Chapter 3. Let me know what you guys thought of Chapter 3 in the comments. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.